Hello there, it's Tom and Magnolia here, and this is Gunnerkrigg Court, Chapter 59, Jeanne.
Hi there.
So this chapter is the end of the 6th volume, and is the first in a two-parter. A two-parter that deals with the plan that Annie and the rest of the gang have put together to deal with Jeanne, the ghost at the bottom of the ravine.
And we can talk about this more later in the chapter, but this is something that you've been setting up in the comic for a long time, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the overarching plot that has been leading up to this point.
Was it exciting to finally get to culminate all this stuff?
Yeah, it was. It was something that I was looking forward to dealing with. And when the time came, it was super fun to do a lot of the artwork for this chapter because I knew it was going to involve a lot of interesting scenery and imagery.
Well, I remember when I saw these pages, I was really... it had never occurred to me to think about what the court used to look like when it was more one with a forest, and I know that this isn't exactly what it looked like because it's, being created, but I think it looks great. And was there a particular era you were looking at for the costumes of the buildings?
Well, that will be brought up a little bit later when we see exactly how this plan is being carried out. But the era is intentionally spotty and all over the place. And while the court and the forest probably did look a lot like this, it was, as we'll see a little bit later, intentionally vague. And I guess on the technical side of things, I wanted these pages especially to look like kind of a badly done watercolor. And these pages were sketched in Photoshop, but then colored in Coral Painter, which is the software package that I like to use for the treatise pages or any large illustrations that I like to spend a bit more time on. And for these ones, I made a custom brush that looked like globby watercolor. The brush that I made to color the backgrounds especially was made to emulate the kind of pooling of color around the edges that you might get through watercolor, especially in the hands of someone who's not very good at watercolor, really. And it really helped get across the effect of a dreamlike sequence where the detail is really only focused around the central characters, in this case Jeanne, and then a little bit later Parley. And even just a few steps away from the central focus of the panel, the detail just washes away. So I was kind of happy how that looked, and I thought it gave a very interesting, very different look to the whole scene.
I remember when these pages came out, people were wondering if this was some sort of alternate history or if Parley had an ancestor who had known Jeanne when they lived in the court together or something like that.
Yeah, that was intentional. I wanted the whole scene to really not make a lot of sense and kind of give the impression that it might be a flashback. But then as soon as we see that Annie is here too, we realize that there's something not quite right going on. And that's when the plan is revealed, where one of the fairies, who we'll just call Blue here, has... After demonstrating that she can manipulate people's minds in the ether, she has been recruited by Annie and the rest of the gang to basically throw up this illusion to keep Jeanne occupied.
Did Red request her outfit?
Sure, I'm sure the two of them collaborated on what their outfits were going to be.
That's cute.
And this book here that Blue is reading is a book that I actually have in real life that I've used a lot of reference out of, and it is just a listing of all the different types of dress that people would wear from 1066 up to modern day in the UK. All she's doing here is looking at the images and just creating these people out of them. And I thought it was a fun way of incorporating a book that I've used a lot in the past.
So the fact that they're faceless is literal, and the fact that they're from all different eras is just because she's popping them in wherever.
Exactly. She's just going through, and Red is pointing out the ones that she thinks look funny and making up the background detail. But Blue does mention that that is not what the important part is. She's focusing most of her energy on making sure that Jeanne thinks that everything looks normal. So for us and for Annie and the other people, it doesn't matter that everything looks a bit vague, as long as Blue is conveying the idea that everything seems normal to Jeanne, then the plan should continue unnoticed. And in the meantime, the rest of the gang in the real world are able to get on with their side of things. And so they're hoping to keep Jeanne occupied while Annie and Kat head off into the middle of the river to find the arrow.
I noticed that in the dialogue, you have the characters point out a lot about how Smitty's powers are affecting things. I think you told me that you had been worried that it was harder to convey that, but I think it comes across pretty well.
Well, the thing with Smitty's powers is that they are very rarely visual, unless I'm intentionally drawing attention to it. But his role in the plan at this point is basically to make sure people are where they need to be, which seems like a very minor role, but it is extremely important for this particular plan.
I thought that the way that you portrayed Kat's attitude in this is interesting too, because she's usually the one who's more confident and gung-ho, but here she really seems concerned. And I know that in later chapters they talk about that more, but did you want to say anything about what you're thinking about Kat during this chapter?
Yeah, in this chapter and the next one, Kat I wanted her to seem like she was very obviously worried about something. Something beyond what the plan is and whether that was going to come to fruition. And we start to get a hint of that when we see a flashback of Annie and Kat talking about how she's going to make some sort of device that will lead them to where the arrow is.
Well, it has the interesting effect of almost making Kat seem like the protagonist of this chapter.
Yeah, I wanted to split the focus between Annie and Kat. And I guess I was trying to give each of the characters their screen time during the whole scene. And there is a reason for each one of them being there. Even Red, who seems to be just goofing off. And so they head off into the middle of the river and find the location of the arrow. And this leads to a nice little sequence here with Annie's etheric form heading down into the water. And coming across this scene here with the skeleton of Jeanne's boyfriend. And this image has been in my mind ever since Annie fell into the river, back in chapter 8. He's always been there, right since the beginning, and now, finally, I had the chance to draw him. But Annie coming closer to the arrow is directly affecting Jeanne. And when she touches it, that starts to wake Jeanne up a little.
Is there anything that you want to say about Robot's design here?
Only in the sense that he is somebody outside of this illusion that Blue has made. And Blue's not really giving him a lot of detail. And the features on his face are sort of swimming around because it kind of mimics what his actual face looks like. And I kind of imagine that Blue might have a bit of trouble bringing Robot into this imaginary realm that she's created. But other than that, I was kind of just trying to make him look cool.
This chapter has a lot of pages, which I think are very effective, where you're leading up to a large moment with a page like this. But do you ever worry about it when it's a webcomic, like having this page up?
I do worry a lot about having pages that could be seen as not having a lot of content. But I am conscious of the fact that they would probably work well in book form. And I think when it comes to large set pieces like this, because I do them so rarely in my comic, when I do have a big event like this, the readers are a bit more forgiving when it comes to pages that merely lead up to a scene rather than are the scene themselves. And during a plan like this, where there's a lot going on with a lot of people doing different roles, I think it pays to have moments for people to catch their breath rather than switching back and forth with zero transition between the actors. But it does switch to Annie here, and she essentially enters into what the arrow is and finds the spirit of the elf guy who's trapped in there.
I noticed that he looks a little bit like how you drew Snuffle's ether form.
A little bit, yeah. And I kind of wanted to allude to that. The etheric form of the creatures from the forest, including these elf people, would be a lot less constrained to real-world physical form than Annie's is.
Yet not quite as free as Coyote's either.
Yeah, that's right. And while the elf guy's not so pleased to see Annie, it does give Annie a chance to use some of her fire powers defensively.
I think you said before that the chapter where you started introducing the fairies and the concept of Jeanne being part of the comic, back when Annie first met the ghost, you said that's when you first started drawing her hair to have a little bit of a curl on it to indicate the fire in her. Is that because that's when you planned all this, including the fact of Annie's fire elemental nature?
Yeah, that was back in chapter 8. But by that point, I'd already written out Jeanne's arc, and I knew what was going to happen. It was just at that point that I started to draw Annie's hair with a bit of a flick to it, to give the indication that there's something more to her.
So we don't see Annie in her fire form too often.
Yeah, and when it comes to drawing her in this state, I wanted it to seem like it's something that you only ever catch a glimpse of before it disappears. I never wanted it to seem like the Human Torch, where she is a superhero and her superpower is that she is made out of fire.
It suits her personality too, since she's not someone you would see those flashes of anger from for more than a moment.
That's what I was hoping to get across, yeah. And here we see that she's using that side of herself as a tool to help her out. And then we switch back to Kat to take a look at what she's been through to get to this point. And we see that she's not only developed the tracker, but also something else that she's reluctant to use. And then switch back to Jeanne and Robot to see what they're up to.
Even though we've seen Robot get sliced up before, this time it's his new kind of body getting sliced up, and even though the panels don't dwell on it much, that must be a whole different experience for him, and a pretty horrifying one. Sure,
we already spent a whole chapter showing that he interfaces very differently with his new body. So you can only imagine what it might feel like for him to go through this. I guess, though, to put people at ease, at this point Robot is still only registering what he would consider to be pain as a new set of data that he examines. So he's not sort of internally screaming in agony or anything here.
I noticed that they chose not to use Coyote's tooth. Did you put a lot of thought into the idea of presenting them with this weapon and then having them elect not to use it?
Yep.
Okay.
And now we switch back to Annie.
Now that we're in this environment, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you laid this out, because it's very interesting and very different to anything we've really seen before in the comic.
I really wanted this to seem like a very abstract place, And I'm not sure how successful I was, but I wanted it to also to seem kind of like a mechanical maze that this elf guy is stuck in.
Did you lay any of it out in SketchUp or anything, or is it all just painted?
No, not for this. Because all the angles and stuff are kind of weird, this might be counterintuitive, but it turned out that when I used a 3D program to sort of help me lay things out, I felt like I was too restricted then. So I didn't really want the angles to make a whole lot of sense. And in the end came to the conclusion that it was better to give hints as to structures and walls and passages rather than try and model it all out in 3D. I did use a bit of 3D later on towards the end of the chapter, and I'll point that out. But whenever I do use any 3D software, it is just to give me a hint and a starting off point to reach the final image. And yeah, in this case, I found that it didn't really help me very much. And as the plan is continuing and Annie's trying to figure out what she's doing, Parley's doing her best to keep Jeanne occupied, now that Jeanne is very aware that something else is going on. And since Jeanne lives in a version of the court that is very closely tied to the forest, she's very aware of creatures like the fairies that might be able to pull tricks on her. And she starts to understand that what she's seeing may not be her reality. And as a ruthless swordsman, she's identified the problem and went straight for it.
This is a big moment, I thought. I was very scared when this page went up.
Yeah, a lot of people were worried, and that was intentional. I wanted it to seem like Blue had been dealt a fatal blow directly to the face, so...
And you did a good job of showing that without making it too gory or shocking or anything like that.
Yeah, she is using a sword, but I needed to keep in mind that I couldn't show gore and anything overtly violent.
It wouldn't have worked really that way.
Yeah.
But I was very relieved when this page came up.
That's kind of the feeling that I want to get across here. And this is the passive ability of Andrew being here, sort of making sure that things are where they should be. And because of this, and Jeanne's experience as a fighter, she then starts to realize the real obstacle in her fight against Parley. And at this point, Blue's illusion is completely shattered. And so she's going to have to square off against Parley face to face. And then quickly going back to Kat and Annie, we see that Kat very reluctantly pulls out a device that she's made that looks very similar to the arrow and touches it against Annie's head, which brings us to the end of the chapter. And I guess just a brief note, this is where I did use some 3D perspective reference for drawing the maze here. But then I was also able to incorporate images of Kat's etheric form.
Well, I can't wait to find out what happens next.
And this bonus page, since it's the end of volume 6, this is the latest treatise page, which is formatted a bit differently to the previous ones. And in some alchemical treatises, they are presented as a sort of diorama with actors on a stage, and I wanted to try and emulate that here. And for me, this is probably one of the more literal treatise pages that I have done in the series. So looking back on it now, I do see ways that I probably could have added some more symbolism to it. But in the end, it was more of a literal depiction of the characters in the story and their respective places in the story as it is right now. So we can see that Annie here is distracted by her father. Jones is keeping an eye on everything from above. Asengrin and Coyote are still on the forest side, but then so are Parley and Smitty, as well as the other forest creatures like the former rabbit and the fairy and Red and Blue. And even though Annie's on the court side, her fire is on the forest side still looking down. And this is also the first time that Kat is actively pointing towards the forest, which has always been the symbol for the more mystical side of the universe that they exist in.
I noticed too that Path and Renard are hanging out, which is very cute.
Yeah, they're two people who are very important to the main characters. So that's the end of that book and that chapter. And come back again for the second part in Gunnerkrigg Court Chapter 60, The Other Shore.
See you next time.